It's great to have all of you here tonight for a really wonderful presentation on the Battle at Paramus Church, Old Paramus Church, 1780. We're in for a real treat. We have one of our commissioners here with us, Mary Amoroso. Mary, do you want to say a few words? We're very lucky to have her as our liaison to the Commissioner Board.
I'm sorry I feel underdressed. I don't have my tricolor. Of course, back in the day, I would not have been an elected official. So, modern times. We are excited to hear about the Old Paramus Reformed Church. Sorry that difficulties intervened and we didn't do Tom Paine, but this will be great. This will be wonderful. And I'm happy you came and found your way, and have a wonderful time.
This is where I get to put on my PBS hat. This lecture series is funded in part by a general operating support grant from the New Jersey Historical Commission, a division of the New Jersey Department of State. Our first speaker this evening, George W. Wright, is a 45-year member of the New Jersey Bar with offices in Hackensack, New Jersey, and New York City. He is a member of the New Jersey Society Sons of the American Revolution and active in historic preservation work. George has a special interest in Bergen County's Revolutionary War history. Now, we're also very fortunate tonight to have a second presenter with us, and Mr. Bill Angresano is a career illustrator and fine artist working in publishing and advertising. He creates paperback book covers, sports posters, and storyboards for film and television. Currently, Bill is a drawing and painting instructor at the Ridgewood Art Institute and teaches figure drawing and anatomy as it applies to animation at Montclair State University. Bill is a commissioned artist in the areas of portraiture and various genre scenes, and he'll be telling us a little bit about one of his really beautiful work of art here tonight that captures the battle at the Old Paramus Church. So without further ado, I'm going to walk over and unmute George, and we're going to get this party started. Thank you, everybody.
What a pleasure, and how exciting it is to be here. I want to thank Bob Carpenter for inviting Bill and I to be here, and thank Colin for helping to put it all together, and all of you for turning out to listen to us talk about a very, very important historical site here in Bergen County, which is the Old Paramus Reformed Church. I was going to start off asking if there were any members of the church here, and now I know there are. That means I can't afford to make any mistakes, and I'll try not to. But Bill and I are here to talk about the church's history from a purely historic standpoint and from an artistic standpoint as well. What I mean by that, I'll talk about the history, Bill will talk about the art. But we've been friends for many, many years. We share an interest in history generally, Bergen County history, art history. And so when we began, I'd say maybe 2 years ago, to talk about two big events that were coming up back to back, one being the 300th anniversary of the Paramus Church, which was last year, and the 250th anniversary of our own independence. When we talk about how important those two events are to a couple of Bergen County guys like us, little by little we started to talk about what the battle must have looked like on the day that this piece of art depicts. So this is actually a full-size reproduction, a full-size print of an oil painting that Bill finished last summer, I believe. And we have extras, if anyone is interested. The prints were produced by Kevin Trimble. Great job, a lot of artistry and expertise. So essentially, this scene depicts what happened on March 23, 1780. Let's talk about the church generally and kind of lead up to what happened in 1780. The church, let me jump ahead to something I stuck in to kind of give all of this some context. Now, all of you probably know where the church is located, but I think it might be helpful to just point out where it is on this aerial map that we would recognize if we drove past it. As you may recognize, this is Route 17. So as you're going north on 17, you'll pass the church on your left. as you come to the exit for West Saddle River Road, and if you go up Saddle River Road, West Saddle River Road that is, you'll pass the Zabriskie Shedler House and this piece of property it sits on. Back in the 18th century, all of this property was owned by the Vallow family and the church until this was sold off in the early 1800s. At the time of the Revolution, though, the battlefield we're looking at, and I have more graphics we'll get to, essentially covers this entire area and more. But this is where the battle unfolded. And Route 17 goes right through it now. So the cemetery is here, another very important part of the church's history, but also an important part of the battle story on this day in March. And I'll come back to this because the other maps that we have are oriented the same way. So I think that might help to give us some continuity. So both the Shedler property and the church are historically significant. The church itself is a National Park Service registered historic district. To the extent I understand what that is, the church property on the west side of Route 17 is comprised of several significant historical buildings, including the church, but also the historical cemetery directly adjacent to the church, and also the Vallow Cemetery, which is here, much bigger and not as old. But the very, very old part of the cemetery is here, and the oldest part is right here, which well predates the Revolution. And all you have to do is go visit the cemetery and look at the grave markers, the stones, and the dates on them to know that. The Zabriskie Shedler House is its own historic site and obtained that designation, that nomination, a few years ago. The house was built in 1825, well after the Revolution. But the reason the property is so significant, there are two reasons. As I'm going to discuss in a minute, that whole area was saturated with Revolutionary War encampments. And I'll explain why later. So by sheer dint of numbers, and what I mean by that is the size of the garrison at any given time, the number of enlisted men, the number of officers, they were all over that area within a few hundred yards. So whether you're talking about the Vallow Cemetery, the area east of Route 17, or that sliver of land where the Shedler house now sits, all of that was covered with tents and branch huts. There were some houses too, but not enough to accommodate hundreds of soldiers. So we know, based on Washington's orders that I'll read to you in a minute, that area was a beehive from 1776 until the end of the war, and particularly in 1780, which is right in the middle of that period. The other reason that the Shedler property is as important to the battlefield story as the property on the west side of 17 is that it was part of the battlefield. And as I'll describe for you shortly with additional maps, that was the site where the British Brigade of Guards launched its attack on the garrison guarding the church, defending the church. So all of this property is extremely important to Bergen County history. Let's move ahead to the next map, and I'll tell you what it is. This is a map from the wonderful book that Mr. Adrian Libya wrote many years ago on the Revolutionary War in the Hackensack Valley. So the reason I picked this map is that it shows exactly what happened on March 22, 23, 1780, where it happened, and who was where. Now, the church is here. So if you look at that point as where all these forces were coming together that the British sent over on the night of March 22, the reason they did this and the result becomes very fascinating. Let me break it down this way. At the time, there were 300 Continental troops at the Paramus Church. Their commanding officer was Major Christopher Stewart. Christopher Stewart was an officer in the 5th Pennsylvania. Now, I assumed for a very long time that meant at the time of the battle, the 5th Pennsylvania was the regiment or part of it, a battalion, defending the church. But thanks to our friend Todd Braystead, I was corrected in my ignorance. In fact, the church was defended at that time, although the commander was Major Stewart. The 300 men guarding the church were from many different states, well, at least 4, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. So by that point in the war, for whatever reason, and we can talk about that, the Continental Army was already becoming a national army, not just a bunch of state militia under their own officers. So this was a diverse, composite, battalion-sized unit. What happened was the British sent over 2 of their most elite units that were in North America at the time. In the dead of the night, Lieutenant Colonel McPherson came across to lower Jersey City now, but Paulus Hook back then, with 300 members of the Scottish Highlanders, the Black Watch, 42nd, 43rd Regiment of Foot, and some Hessians, I think from the Ansbach Regiment. They were supposed to meet up with an even more brutal, fearsome unit led by Colonel John Howard. Those were the Brigade of Guards, a very, very elite unit that pushed off from Manhattan at about the same time from here, from the Spuyten Duyvil area, went up to Closter Dock, disembarked, and were going to come across due west with a hook up here and descend on the church by surprise before sunrise. And the plan was so ambitious that McPherson was supposed to complete an attack and the sacking of Hackensack. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but they were going to meet at the same time, simultaneously. Well, think about how ambitious that was in 1780. There was no communication to do that. It would have been sheer accident. But that was their plan, because this was their ultimate destination, their target. It didn't quite happen that way, but they came very close. So Hackensack gets attacked at night. McPherson comes up with his Hessians and Black Watch from the south along basically what was the forerunner of Route 17, but a road led up on the east side of the Saddle River Road, crossed over just maybe 100 yards south of the church today, and then continued up north. And the reason the church was such an important strategic place is it was at a crossroads. It was at the intersection of this road running north and south, the road running northwest to Stony Point, Kings Ferry, which was a major point of departure and embarkation, and also to the northwest to the Cloves, which is the mountain pass where Suffern's is located. Suffern. I'm calling it by what General Washington called it. So this is the setting for what happened on March 23rd. Now, Paramus Church was one of a number of fortifications and continental listening posts. Washington never intended, and Washington established this church as one of his key links in this series of posts that ran all the way from West Point to Springfield, New Jersey. So imagine a line of posts like this, some of which were made to be defended, like West Point, but some like Paramus that were not intended to be defended, but just occupied and used to conduct surveillance and patrol activity. What were they doing? Well, they were bivouacked at Paramus and the area around it. Well, as I mentioned, they were sending out patrols. They were watching most importantly, they were watching what the British were up to on the Hudson, because now remember, the British had their own line of posts. They control the Hudson at this point. Everything below West Point, they had Stony Point, they had Fort Lee, they had Paulus Hook, now Jersey City. So think of these two lines, one British, one American, as kind of facing each other. And in between, where a lot of us live, was kind of a no man's land. The county was pretty evenly split between Patriot and Tory sympathizers. And then there was a third that were sitting it out. But this was a very dangerous time to live in this area, whether you were a soldier or a civilian. So Washington used these fortifications, these locations, to maintain surveillance on the enemy, to deter loyalist militia activity, because they wanted to intimidate. They knew that Bergen County produced a lot of soldiers, a lot of militia troops, uniformed militia troops that joined the British Army. And Washington well understood the dangerous potential, and he intended to hold New Jersey. Once the British evacuated and hunkered down in New York City, he intended to hold New Jersey and eventually retake New York City. Didn't happen that way, but that was his intention. So the commanding officers at the Paramus church fortification reported directly to Washington. He handpicked them. He picked loyal people that he could trust. And they reported directly to him, and there was no chain of command between these guys and Washington. So we have in 1778, Colonel Thomas Clark, who was an officer with the North Carolina Brigade. So the North Carolinians were among the first to be posted at this church. I'm not sure if there was a full regiment or let alone the full brigade. Might have been up to 2,000 people, but at any given time, by the time the 1780 battle occurs, there are 200 to 400 Continental troops at that church. Here were Washington's orders to Colonel Clark, and I'm going to read several lines because there's a couple of key phrases that lock in what happened and illustrate what happened 2 years later. These were Washington's priorities, let's call them. Speaking to Colonel Clark, "You are to quarter the men in as compact a manner as possible, both for the preservation of discipline and the conveniency of drawing your force speedily together in case of an alarm. Should you receive information that the enemy are moving up the North River, the Hudson River, in force, you are to instantly fall back with the troops to Suffern, we would call it today, at the entrance to the Clove." So here he is in 1778 making it very clear that this location is not to be defended to the death. It is to be occupied and used as an encampment, as a cantonment, and evacuated if necessary. The last thing Washington wanted at any time he was the commander-in-chief were for any of his troops to be surrounded and wiped out. The demoralizing effect that would have had, we can only imagine, especially in a place like Bergen County. So it was very important for him to make sure he had this post under command of a trustworthy officer who knew exactly what to do and what Washington wanted him to do under certain circumstances, i.e., faced with overwhelming force, because that's what's going to happen on March 23rd, 1780. So troops are to be kept together and tightly organized, tightly controlled, and ready to move out if they have to. That's for 2 years before this battle. If we go back to the Libby map, I think I've already described what forces were coming from what direction and what they were doing along the way. But bear in mind that all of this, the sacking burning of Hackensack, the pillaging of Hackensack by the Black Watch and the Hessians, all that was going on in the middle of the night while they moseyed up the Paramus Road to the church, while Howard and his men were coming west from Closter Dock at at the speed of a forced march. They were in a big hurry to get there before dawn because they wanted complete surprise if they could get it. They didn't, thankfully, but they were moving with all deliberate speed to get there. And that's a long distance for these men to march. But these elite troops, it's hard for us to imagine how fit these guys were 250 years ago. But what Howard put together were initially 4 flank companies. These were the biggest, toughest, most aggressive guys, whether they were grenadiers or light infantry, and the brigade of guards had both. They were the shock troops. These were the guys that were going to be the hammer that were going to capture and crush Stuart and his men if they could catch them before dawn. So this was a force to be reckoned with. The fact that Clinton and in his absence, General Kniphausen, who took over from him, picked these guys tells you that they meant business. They were out for blood. Now, Colonel Howard, by the way, he was the 15th Earl of Suffolk. That's apropos nothing, but I just throw that out. His father was a Royal Marine officer, a very serious man, not a man to be trifled with. So they had their George Patton in charge of these 300 Brigade of Guards, and they were very combat hardened. The guardsmen had been fighting since the summer of 1776, and they were very experienced. They could be counted on, very disciplined, and still at this point in the war, they were more or less intact. That would not be true a year later when they were sent down to the Carolinas. They were decimated. But here in the early part of 1780, they were in their prime. So this is what Major Stuart was facing. He didn't know it yet, but he was. Move on to our next map. So just to, you can see it kind of overlays the aerial, and it's a smaller, more close-up version of the Libby map. But here we are. Here's the church. Here are here's we'll call them the McPherson force, the Hessians and Black Watch coming up. The Americans are here, and here comes Howard. And we're going to talk about how complex his next maneuvers were. They had to have been planned in great detail because they had all of this very well rehearsed, very well choreographed. What happened was Major Stuart, at about 6 a.m., got his first warning that these guys were headed north from Hackensack. So he begins to gather all the men who are encamped in houses here and here, and some down here. And then there was also up here above the Shedler property, on the other side of Warimus Road, where the Banta property is, there was a picket post with half a dozen men. So they were keeping watch here. There was another picket post here. But probably a messenger first warned Stuart at about 6 a.m. that McPherson's force was on its way, and they burned Hackensack. He didn't know about Howard yet. So he starts to form his men, gather them, and what you'll see in a more detail in the next graphic, and in Bill's painting to some extent, is a stone wall that existed at that time just on the north side of the cemetery. We don't know how long it was. We don't know how high it was. We know it was stone. We know it had to be here from numerous descriptions of where it was. But this is where Stuart posted most of his men. And what happened, I will read directly from Stuart's report to Washington the next day, which is how we know so much about what happened. Howard wrote his own report to his commanding officer, General Matthew, who was in England, but that's who he was still reporting to. Howard, by the way, was such a competent, trusted British officer. He was the acting brigadier general of the Brigade of Guards when he was sent on this mission with only a battalion of 300 to smash the Americans here at the church. Basically what happened is, let me show with the next map because I think it's easier to follow. So I'm going to come back to this map when we talk about the winding down of this battle, which was really a non-battle when we start to talk about the lack of casualties. So the first description in time we have from that morning is Major Stewart writing to General Washington the next day about what happened. And he leaves some things out, which military officers are wont to do. But here's what he tells Washington happened. At 6 o'clock yesterday morning, I received information of the enemy's being in Hackensack. In consequence, I gave the necessary orders for assembling the troops under my command. I heard a firing up the road. Now he's talking about the West Saddle River Road above the Shedler property. And that's about 3/4 of a mile to that picket post. Up the road leading to King's Ferry, upon which I readily concluded it must be an attack made upon a sergeant's picket posted there. So by 7 a.m., after he first hears about the Highlanders approaching from the south, now he knows someone is even closer, and it's Howard and his brigade of guards. So let me skip ahead and describe what Howard did. I'm going to jump back just for a moment because I haven't explained that the way Howard intended to tie the noose around the Americans in the church, he was going to attack them from the north, but from two different directions. And maybe from a third direction, because here's what he does. When he gets to the Banta property here, that's where they surprised the picket post. The guys on picket duty came running down this road back to the church. So that's what Stewart was describing in his report. The British, Howard's 300, then break up. One company comes south under Captain Stewart. I believe they're light infantry. Their job is to seize the bridge. So the Americans can't escape this way. That was not likely to happen with them knowing the Hessians were coming from this direction. But they weren't taking any chances. One company of about 50 comes south along the river, and this is only half a mile, 3/4 of a mile. The others continue over the ford on Werimus Road up to this point, and another company of Coldstream Guards is sent west to attack Hoppertown, to attack the Hopper House, which is now Hohokus. Howard's main force then turns left, comes down West Saddle River Road to what I believe was the upper part of the Shedler property, or at least the middle. He then fans them out into double files, double ranked lines, because that's how they attacked at this point in the war. They fell into formation in two parallel lines. So in this case, there would have been about 100 men in each parallel line, one behind the other. They were spread out, because that was the light infantry way of fighting by this point in the war. They spread out either above or on the Shedler property with charged bayonets. And although Howard describes in his report that he had them load their weapons, he never describes in his report to Matthew that they actually fired them. And I believe they did not fire them until they had reached the stone wall. So I'll read what happens at that point. It's very, very interesting. So you have 190 men in the middle. 50 have gone off to Hoppertown. Another 50 or 60 have gone south to the bridge. So you have the toughest guys in the middle. Three companies, about 60 each, probably grenadiers. Here's Matthew's description of how he deployed them. And he's seeing the Americans behind the wall with Stewart in charge. I found them, the Americans, drawn up behind a stone wall before the church, meaning in front of the church facing him. They altered their position with their left to a barn, which would be where the Schoolhouse Museum is now. The American left flank extending to the barn beyond the stone wall, part of them remaining behind the wall and seemed determined to wait for our coming. But on ordering our men to form and attack, they immediately fled. I'm not so sure that's true, but this is what Colonel Howard, how he chooses to describe how the enemy fled at the mere sight of he and his men. Now, McPherson, who's in charge of the Black Watch, the 300 Black Watch and Hessian troops coming up from the south, he sends his own report the next day. Everybody's reporting this the next day, so it's pretty fresh and it's pretty immediate and to a large extent accurate. McPherson writes to General Kniphausen, who's in charge in Manhattan, about a quarter of an hour after 7 o'clock in the morning, we heard a scattering fire in our front. So he's still on his way to the church. On this, we pushed and got within a quarter of a mile of Paramus Church. He's right below the bridge that then crossed over. When we observed the enemy run and Colonel Howard with the guards in pursuit of them. So what McPherson is describing is that by the time he got up the road to a place where he could see the Americans withdrawing from the wall and the guards in pursuit, he didn't join the fight. That would have been a mistake for a very simple reason, because then you would have had one commander interfering with the victory of another, perceived victory at the time, and there would have been confusion. So McPherson very properly stayed on the east side of the Saddle River at the bridge while Howard pursued the Americans about a mile in the southwesterly direction. So that wasn't the end of it. But that's what McPherson described when he came within visual and audio distance of the fighting. Scattered fire. It wasn't British fire. The British were relying on their bayonets to rout the Americans because that was more terrifying. They weren't fighting. The British were not fighting at that time the way they did at Bunker Hill. They weren't marching up in a phalanx, shooting, reloading, marching a little further. They were forming well beyond the effective range of their enemy, here Continentals, in their double-ranked lines and moving briskly, and then at a full gallop, at a full sprint, that last 100 yards. So that's how the British approached the Americans who were at the wall at the time. Well, I do believe that Howard correctly describes the orderly, disciplined American withdrawal. Stuart ordered his men to withdraw from the right to the left. And so in other words, from the direction of the river, he moved them out first and had the guys closest to where the Schoolhouse Church would be now, covering them as they withdrew. So it was a staged, I'm sure it was fast, but it was organized and orderly, a withdrawal. So those red arrows at the bottom of the map that you see, essentially chasing the blue lines, which are the Continental troops, that was the extent of the pursuit. There was no conventional collision of these forces, either with bayonets or shooting, but there was shooting at the time. McPherson heard it, and there was shooting later, which we'll get to. Well, here's how one Hessian officer describes what he heard about the battle. Now, he wasn't there. This is General Baumeister, who at this point is an old man. He's a Hessian officer, a major general. He's in Manhattan, but he's writing directly to the Hessian Secretary of State. So Baumeister's boss back in Europe is a high-ranking political person. So Baumeister is going to be reporting reliable information from his officers in the field about what they saw. And here's what he tells the Hessian Minister of State about what happened when the Americans were confronted with this 2-to-1 force 300 against 300. So 2-1. He writes, the rebels in the meantime had taken a position in the church graveyard. So that's how close the stone wall was to the north face of this church. And by the way, in Bill's painting, if you look closely, you can see the stone wall kind of extending west to east, and it vanishes a little bit at this point because the troops are there and they're blocking it, they're over the wall. But we believe this is where it was, right along East Glen Avenue and along what is now a metal fence that extends just to the left of the old part of the cemetery. That's where the fighting took place. That's where these Hessian troops told their superiors the action occurred. Taking a position in the church graveyard, and their commander, Major Stewart, they knew who he was, made a valiant defense. No indication of running away, but a valiant defense is how the Hessians described it. He was compelled to fall back, and on his retreat, he encountered Lieutenant Colonel McPherson's detachment, the Black Watch, to the south. The heavy firing, and this is important, the heavy firing alarmed a great part of Jersey, and enemy troops approached from all sides. Now, he's describing no longer being at the church. He's talking about the retreat back to Hackensack, back to Newbridge. That's where they were all. They had rendezvoused at the church, all 600 of the British, and they were heading back to Newbridge. So what this report is talking about is what happened during the British retreat from the church back to Newbridge. That's where the Americans had some fun. The heavy firing alarmed a great part of New Jersey. He's talking about the militia. He's not talking about Stuart and the Continentals. Enemy troops approached from all sides. These are locals. In such numbers that our detachments could not hope for further success. Therefore, they decided to retreat over Newbridge. This gave the enemy so much courage that they followed close upon the heels of our detachments and even made some prisoners. So the battle doesn't end with the Continentals skedaddling and disappearing. Some of them did, but basically turning around, regrouping with the Bergen County militia, or at least a lot of them, that heard what was going on and came out to help the Continentals. Now, I've studied the war in New Jersey for a long time, and that didn't happen very often. And maybe some of you can give other examples, but the fact that it happened in Paramus on this day is in itself a significant piece of military history. So Major Stewart retreats, he counterattacks in a limited form. He pursues the 600 British back to Newbridge. Here's what he writes to Washington. This is a continuation of his report the next day. Now he's describing the end of the operation and the chasing the British back to Newbridge. As soon as the enemy found their intentions were frustrated, they seemed more disposed to plunder than pursue us, and immediately commenced their retreat from the church down the Hackensack Road, plundering indiscriminately. I was not able to collect more than 100 men. So out of the 300 he started with, when Howard attacked with bayonets, a lot of them kept going, didn't come back in a hurry, but he had 100 of his men come back, and he was joined by a few dozen militia. Then the enemy is supposed to be about 500. I then ordered the men to unsling their packs and detached a subaltern, a junior officer, lieutenant, and 20 men, 20 of his men, with orders to harass them. That is, to harass the retreating column going back to Newbridge. While I and the rest of the detachment was close after, on my way down, I was joined by perhaps 30 militia, local men, who behaved with great spirit. So this is how this operation ended. It ended as surprisingly as it began. It ended on a high note for Major Stewart. What he did, by obeying the letter and spirit of Washington's order, he kept his 300 troops alive. And that was Washington's philosophy of warfare. Don't stand and die. Retreat when you have to, live to fight another day. So by following that order and his common sense, because Major Stewart was quite an experienced combat officer himself, he kept his 300 Continentals from becoming like the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, kept them from being wiped out. So, kudos to Major Stewart. That concludes my remarks. I'm going to turn the floor over to Bill and let him talk about his work. Bill? Okay, thank you.
As I'm looking at my painting, was I accurate? Was I trying to be accurate? Let's talk briefly the history of art in painting, the history of battle scenes in the history of painting. So on the screen you see that is an Egyptian battle. Now in those days, largely to make the pharaoh look heroic, also to chronicle an actual battle. So this was probably the beginnings. The Assyrians, the Egyptians, go on to the Greek, Roman, go into the Renaissance. You all been to the Met. You walk on the front steps. Tiepolo did this painting of a Roman battle scene where the head of the main character could probably fit right in here. So it's a huge, you know what I'm talking about, straight up the stairs, huge. So the history of art and battle scenes, history paintings, it's probably the first thing that art was supposed to be doing. It's a glorified form of illustration. You've heard that. Michelangelo's an illustrator. Sistine Chapel, right? It's meant to inform, ennoble, flatter, national pride, et cetera, et cetera. So in the history of painting, excuse me, another battle scene, Egyptian. Now, jump another, what? Yeah. Here's a great painter, French painter. I'm not thrilled with the draftsmanship, but great French painter, and it's Napoleon in Egypt. So nothing's changed. The drama, the historical significance of battles between nations, peoples, cultures, rich genre. As painters, we can never get cocky with this. When you go into this area, very difficult to do. And so now this leads me to this painting, Ernest Messonnier. Just look at this. This is also at the Met. This is in the 19th century wing. This took him 11 years to make. Not every day 11 years, but on and off 11 years. I'll just give you one detail. Obviously, he's very proficient with the human figure. Proportion, the anatomy, drapery, all things you're vigorously taught in academic schools that originated after the Renaissance. Those were very strong schools. But then you got to France, England, Germany, Italy, Spain. They called it the academics. Now these artists were vigorously trained. You did 2 years just black and white. You studied ancient casts that were lit just to study form on the human figure. That's 2 years black and white. Then you went into life work, the nude. That's another year, and only if you mastered that, you went into color. So you're talking 4 to 6 years of academic training. Then you apprenticed or worked with a master. So, just to name one, Ernest Messonnier came from that background. Now, just for interest's sake, the maniac so in this day and age, there's no what do you call you photographers know. There was photography, but not rapid, like bang, 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 bang to get the horses. So how did he do that? How is he so proficient with movement on the horses? Besides the fact that he was tremendously wealthy from his paintings, because it was a big market, this was their cinema. So he had a railroad tie put in a field and got the cavalry to sprint. Not once, not twice, all day long. And he was on the railroad car sketching. And human beings pulled him while he sketched, just to get the tendons and where does that leg go? And, Muybridge wasn't around. Muybridge, the famous photographer of movement. Nude men and women, nude children, horses, camels, everything. Muybridge. Way before this. So he made models. He had the grass trampled in a field so he could do studies of how grass looks trampled. That's the extent and that's the genre of battle painting that as an artist, contemporary, you're kind of competing with, or you at least you don't want to embarrass yourself. So Ernest Messonnier, the Met, if you're interested, you'll love it, the original. So we know who this is. Now, the Europeans trained the Americans, more or less. George Washington, by the way, there's fabulous books on, along with being a tremendous leader, world figure. To this day, we admire him. The more you read about him, he was amazing. But on top of everything else, he was responsible for bringing big-time painting to the United States. The great French sculptor, and his name flew out of my head. Houdin. Thank you. Who said that? See, you're historians. The great French sculptor Houdin came and drew and sculpted. Then the Peel family, and a number of American artists pictured George Washington. Now this gentleman, Lutz is his last name. Yeah. Let me make sure I get it. Leutz. Thank you. Yeah, George, stay on top of me. Yeah, Leutz. And you've seen this. It's the side of a wall. It's the side of the wall. I remember as a young child staring at the ice for hours. My parents had the drag. That's enough. But he was German, became American, but European trained. So the European academism, all I'm going to tell you, like I said, this is a talk for another day. It made its way to the States. The Germans, the Swiss, French, Italian, British artists. That academic training slowly infiltrated, and now you've got American art. Let's go another 80 years from Leutz. Here's American illustrator Howard Pyle. Now in this country, the United States, we were still young. Europe now is getting into what? Avant-garde. It's no longer representational painting. Impressionism turned into post-impressionism, abstraction, on and on. We, on the other hand, we have illustrated magazines, we have commerce, we have posters. So we're vibrantly still interested in the human figure, representational painting. And so Howard Pyle is most oftenly called the father of American illustration. Again, academically aware, if not trained. I don't think he went to Europe, by the way. He's an amazing character in his own right. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Pyle did quite a bit of work in the Revolution, about the Revolution. So Howard Pyle, father of American illustration, N.C. Wyeth, Washington at Yorktown, Dean Cornwell, Betsy Ross. The Americans almost turned the clock back on academism and became the new beacon of classical art as we know it. The human figure, drawing, drafting. Now, the irony of that is Norman Rockwell, Don Troiani. It's still going on, Don Troiani. It's still going on today. Tom Lovell. I knew Tom Lovell. He's since passed, but this is, George, what's the general at Ticonderoga? Thank you. See, this is a good crowd. So this painting, Tom Lovell, 50s, 60s, 70s, worked just like Messonnier. Made clay models, painted time of day, tried to get to the actual, but then he's composing. What makes Tom Lovell stand out, along with some of his contemporaries, Meade Schaefer, Clymer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't even hear of these guys. You've seen their paintings. You don't even hear of them. But the American art in illustration, in the area of illustration, kind of went back to the era of Messonnier, where they strong emphasis on the human figure, and what is it doing? It's chronicling history, American history, world history. National Geographic, magazines that, American Heritage, they still care about history. You guys still care. It's amazing. It's not going anywhere, but you're kind of in the minority. So, yeah, so that's it on the art lesson of the history of painting, of battle painting. Now, I'm sure when you see paintings, if you like them, I'm talking about paintings like this. Listen, I love Cézanne, I love the Impressionists. I paint impressionistically. I mean, I would consider I'm an impressionist. I love plein air. I love to go out and paint time of day. But again, when you're commissioned, George graciously had commissioned me to do this. I'm not unfamiliar with this approach. I did years of paperback book covers, historical romance, where you have to there are people that used to read those fanatically. Westerns. The Italian-American from New Jersey is painting Westerns. But I went out west, and I studied the horse to the point where I could draw it out of my head, how it would move. Because I was competing. Tom Lovell was still alive at that time. Maybe you've heard these names: James Bama, Tom Lovell, Frank McCarthy, the Western painters. Now they all went out west. They made a fortune. That genre is still going. Western art, American Western art, Indian history. That's still a vibrant genre. And there are those, the elite of the art world, if they want to call. I don't even know if they're around visibly, but there are those that don't consider history painting even art. It's illustration, or it's whatever. Okay, so now let's get to the painting and the scene. How do you do this? Did you ever look at a battle scene, or I mean, and just say, where do you start? How do you do this? Well, everything starts in the mind. I have to have a visual description written on the actual, or as close to the actuality. We have eyewitnesses, so you absorb that. But as a painter, you're less interested in, well, this is exactly what he said. No. The first thing you want to do is, which I hope happens, is when you look at this, it's visually your eye is compelled. Like you're there. Are you there? Well, you're supposed to be. So the first thing is composition. After you do all your research, you want a compelling piece. A juxtaposition of values, lights, darks, shapes. It's no different than a still life that compels you. When you go to the museum, a still life or a landscape, foreground, middle ground, background. All these things come into play, even though you have to tell a story. So as you're telling a story, you don't want to be so tight to the word as you are to the feeling. So what I tried to do is, as George said, it wasn't a classic confrontation. More like a boxer that double jabs, feints, and then steps over to the side. And you got to go catch him. And then when you get too close, he throws another combination, steps to the other side and waits, and then comes back. So obviously, I was thinking about this when you were talking. I mean, it's obvious. I took the viewpoint of the colonials, the Americans, to be. And so he's important because there's your humanity. He's the everyman. Now, funny story about this, and I've said this the last time. That model, he's a reenactor. So the only model I used was this fella here. These guys I kind of created from, I looked in the mirror, how do you shoot? And I sketched from my own image, from neighbors, I got a reference. But I needed a model I wanted him to be special. So he's your only model. Now, as I went to photograph, he's standing there. Remember what I said? He's standing there. Hi there. I'm a reenactor, and I'm young, and this is a beautiful day. So as I drew him, I was suffering. I go, I can't, he's too upbeat. So I made him a little, I roughed him up. I made him a little, his beard. Correct. And obviously, anxiety, tension, whatever. Now, as you can see, now let's talk about approach. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me show you this real quick. You don't even go to this stage yet. How do you start? Thumbnails. Does anyone know that the process, right? Thumbnails. So first you got to get the story on a small level. Then you do drawings, you do many, this is like nothing compared to what I did. I did, each gentleman here is a head study on a separate canvas, just to get time of day, bone structure, light? What's the attitude? They have to be separate. Then you look at your painting and you go and you fuse it into the drawing. We'll get into that. See, first you lay it all out, and then you do the studies. Then you use the studies to do the finish. So you're practicing costumes. What did they, like George said? I didn't do any Hessians. By the way, George, what did we say? Here's Washington's crack troops. They had the funny hats on, the leather. No, they were peaked. I don't know what that is, but this is Washington's main guys. The green probably represented North Carolina. So there was a smattering and crack troops, Washington, and then there's like I say, the everyman, the local militia. So you do studies, costumes, you do thumbnails, a lot of thumbnails. What looks good? What composition? We started by just wanting to be on this side of the church and do a corner of the church, and the British are coming from the wall. So you'd have about 5 colonials, tombstone. You could tell the whole story in that. Then as I sketched that, I didn't like it. I wanted something more panoramic. So the thumbnails finally morphed into, instead of five figures, then you get the whole like a panorama. So you get the church in there, the time of day, 7 o'clock in the morning. By the way, so I went there and I did a small color note, 7 o'clock in the morning in March. It was freezing. The sun was so strong that if you were there, you wouldn't want to be, one of the colonials, because if they came this way, the sun's right in your eye. So anyway, I chose the moment where they're already breaching the wall. And now they're coming back a little bit, but they're volleying. It's as if they said, fire, stop. Like I said, jab, move, stop, get back, now come forward again, and all at once, drama, fire all at once. And I think they lost 4 Brits, 6 Brits total, nothing.
One killed.
One killed.
Several wounded.
There he is.
One British.
Several wounded. So, drama, interest, hopefully, humbly. And then I want you, like I say, look, he's the largest element. So this leads you here. These lead you around. Hopefully you come back and you start again. That's deliberate. The other funny thing here is when I did the church, the Reformed Church as it looks today. It wasn't like that. It was octagonal.
Really?
Yeah. So I guess it's a style from Holland, right? Right? Europe. And so I just painted it in octagonal. 8 sides. 8 sides. And we didn't see any bullet holes in the wall, but I bet you that they would come pretty darn close to it, because I'm sure they used it as somewhat of a hiding point. Octagonal. And then head studies. Just, you're trying to feel, and then the last thing is, I had the Washington's main guard, but if that was blue, and it's all blue. Isn't that boring? Blue and red. So I played games. We got browns and skins and nothing inaccurate. Wool hat, and they're in the cemetery. So, last thing, once you're satisfied, now you just go for it. You take your landscape sketch. Here's my landscape sketch. Here's my people sketches. But before I even get into that, it's just laying out shapes. And then you go into detail, because what I'm going to do is take this architect's paper, it's vellum, you put it on the canvas, and you painstakingly trace just the outside shape. You don't want to get too crazy, because there are people that are crazy. Their drawing looks like they're painting. But you want to have a little fun, just do outside shape. Like he's a lot different to me than this guy turned out to be. He's more formidable or important. So you want to have a little fun. But after you do all the drawing, put it on canvas, trace it, now you paint. And I usually start, Tom Lovell told me, background, foreground. Why? Your sky lights your subject. Sky determines what this is. But it was very hard to pull off, because this is glaring light, and then very strong shadows on the tombstones. So I low-keyed it a little bit. But anyway, and that's it. Thank you for coming again. Thank you.
From the time you first started till you completed it, I mean, it looks like there's many, many, many steps.
Actual work, probably
That you had to go through.
a good month. Yeah, good month. Not the research, the actual work. And when I say a month, and not every day, probably 3 hours a day.
How long was the research? I mean, when you started?
Probably another month or two that George and I conferred. Yeah.
George, how did you get enamored with this subject to want to do all this research?
I heard somewhere, maybe through our SAR network, that this is going back 3 years, just about 3 years this time of the year, that the Shedler property was being considered for an ambitious artificial turf field, which had started out years earlier as a sports field with a dirt surface, a soil field. So that seemed, the more I thought about it, to threaten the historical integrity of the property. The property is registered as the 1825 house and the 7 acres around it. So I had remembered years earlier reading the Libby book and seeing that very map that I put up, and particularly the part where Howard is coming off of West Saddle River Road and approaching the stone wall head on. So that told me he had to have crossed this property in force. So that drew me in and got me to really researching everything that could be found about what happened that day. And I also consulted a military history PhD from Temple University, Gregory Irwin, who's one of the best in the country, a thorough expert on 18th and 19th century infantry tactics. So with Gregory's tutelage, I reconstructed, and I only touched on some of it today, reconstructed what it looked like as Howard came down with his main force of 190 grenadiers, presumably, and deployed. How did they do that, and where did they do it, and why did they do it that way? So that took a lot of research back into British Army manuals from the early 1700s. But I'm convinced, and I convinced Gregory, we convinced each other that they were deployed hundreds of yards from the stone wall. I was not able to convince the New Jersey DEP of that. And the larger question was, should that 7 acres be folded into the existing NPS designation as a battlefield? And that was the debate for 2 years. So, but to answer your question, that's what drew me in, the idea that what I considered a sacred piece of property, and we're also talking about the encampments, but what first attracted me to the question was the military operation that day in 1780. Where did it happen, and did any of it happen on the Shetler property or not? So that's my answer to your question. That's what got me really interested, and I had always kind of been looking for a project to really drill down and look at a single event in great detail, and it just seemed to present itself to me.
You mentioned Hoppertown, and there was a raid on Hoppertown in 1780, I believe.
Less than a month later, another one.
That was my question. It wasn't part of the Battle of Paramus Church, but the Hopper House was destroyed and
Yes.
ultimately got rebuilt as the Hohokus Inn in the future at some point.
I'm not sure if that's the location, but it was right there. I read that it's where the post office is. Maybe someone knows more about that. But yes, that was 3 weeks later. A separate event, and an American officer, Biles, was murdered. He surrendered. He was captured. We think that the Tory officer who was there at the time with the British committed the murder and stabbed him or shot him. I don't recall which, but he had surrendered by all accounts. So that was April of 1780. But I may have neglected to mention that there were a total of 8 engagements from 76 to 81, 8 engagements in or near this church. So it all goes back to the strategic importance, the crossroads, and that anything happening in Bergen County going north and south was going to pass through that area. So hence the reason why they're there and why it's being attacked over and over again.
I have 2 quick, easy questions. Number one, where is this bridge in the Saddle, over the Saddle River, and is it still there?
No, we have pictures of it, and we know where it was, but imagine whether you're coming south or north, picture about 50 yards, let me point it out, just below the church. So the church is here. So this is West Saddle River Road. It used to run this way right past the church and then turn over the Saddle River. So where 17 crosses over the Saddle River, and you wouldn't know where that is unless you were looking for it, but the river runs just below the church, but it's right here is where the bridge was. So this is the bridge that British Captain Stewart rushed to grab. It's the bridge where McPherson came up and stayed, waiting for the guards to finish what they were doing. So it would be right about here, I believe, because here's the river. I think that's the river coming down, so it's here.
Thank you. And my other question, I know nothing of the mechanics of art, therefore this may seem simplistic to you. How does one trace the vellum work onto canvas?
Good question. So let's say this is canvas. You take, I make homemade graphite paper. I rub graphite, soft, sneaky, and I put it under each section at a time, and painstaking, yeah. But not so painstakingly, like I said, that you're, I gotta copy my drawing. No, because you're gonna ruin it anyway when you paint. You redraw it when you paint. And it's old school.
We have one more month in this season, and we're going to be here at this exact same place, well, before we even get to that, round of applause for our speakers. excellent presentation. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking the time to come out.